that I can welcome and introduce Professor Raoul Eshelman as today's plenary speaker. Raoul Eshelman is Professor of Slavic Literature at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. He received his BA from Rutgers University in the USA before studying in Konstanz, where he received his MA and PhD in Slavic Literature. He has been teaching at the Slavic Department at the LMU since 2009. His scholarly interests focus on philosophy after post-structuralism, film studies, postmodernism, and post-postmodernism. I would like to add that Professor Eshelman is the author of the theory of performatism that he has presented in numerous articles, and especially in his book, Performatism or the End of Postmodernism, published in 2008. In this book, he presents numerous examples from literature, art, cinema, architecture, and theory to describe a new aesthetic and philosophical paradigm, the paradigm of performatism, that replaces or that has replaced the older paradigm of postmodernism. I personally find the book very interesting and inspiring. And one of the many things that appeal to me, I must admit, is the fact that Professor Eshelman uses a lot of examples from Slavic literature, Slavic culture, and I have even found a reference to a Slovak novel in one of his articles. I'm really happy and honored that he has accepted my invitation, and I look forward to his talk, Coping with Capitalism, Frames, Spheres, and the Search for Transcendence. I believe that we all agree that any tip, any suggestion how to cope with the complexities of the contemporary world is most welcome, and I hope that we will get some tips during the talk. Thank you very much once again, Professor Eshelman, for accepting my invitation, and now the floor is yours. Okay, we can't hear you. No.
Here we go.
Oh, now it's great. Yeah, now I can hear you.
Okay, I want to thank Sonia for inviting me. I'm very pleased and honored to be here. I'm a little bit of a, as you have heard, a fish out of water. I am an American, but I am not a specialist in American literature or Anglophone literature. So that in this talk, I will use an example from film. I think that's the area where I have the most expertise. I just have to fiddle around a little bit with the technical things. I have to try to load my PowerPoint presentation, if you, which you should now is. Yes. I assume that you can now see the PowerPoint.
You can see it now. Yes.
So
maybe you would like to share it in the full form, if you wish.
Yes, I'll share it in the full form. It's now in the full form.
Yeah, perfect.
So I will start as best as I can. Okay. The title, as you see, Coping with Capitalism, Frames, Spheres, and Transcendent Truth Processes After Postmodernism. And I think in the last 25 years, we have experienced the complete ascendancy of global capitalism. Capitalism has penetrated to the very last corners of what used to be called the Third World, and any economic alternatives or pockets of resistance that may have existed there have effectively disappeared. In the early 1980s, Frederick Jameson famously tied this development to what he first called postmodernism and later postmodernity. And he convincingly defined the resulting cultural dominant using familiar terms such as depthlessness, schizophrenia, weakening of historicity, waning of affect, etc., etc. Given the undisputed dominance of global capitalism, one could expect that the net effect of economic globalization over the last 25 years would have been to intensify, expand, and solidify the postmodern conditions described by Jameson in his seminal book. However, if we observe cultural developments over the last 2 decades, we find something drastically different, I think. And rather than proliferating endlessly, rather than becoming even more intensive, postmodernism in the form described by Jameson has almost entirely evaporated from the cultural scene. And in its place, we find works that stress things like agency, sincerity, autonomy in subjectivity, works that focus on previously metaphysical goals such as love, truth, transcendence, belief, and works that deliberately block or repudiate postmodern strategies of irony, of endless criticism and simulation. And my point being that this is the main point. This is I'm a kind of neo-formalist. If there is indeed a causal connection between global capitalism and culture, then the terms assumed by Jameson must evidently be reversed. It is the cultural dominant that determines how we experience economic developments and not the other way around. So I'm kind of a non-Marxist in that regard. In my presentation, I would like to, which is not quite that, I would like to argue that our new cultural dominant is marked by artistic and, to a certain extent, real-life strategies that no longer try to undermine capitalism ironically or promote resistance from the periphery. Instead, these new strategies create plural, but at the same time singular frames, bubbles, or spheres within global capitalism that offer us a space to rest from, resist, cope with, or even exploit for our own ends its all-pervasive reality. And these free spaces within capitalist culture try to provide distinct ethical, spiritual, and aesthetic alternatives to postmodernism. Now, the question is as to what extent these spaces are really free. This is the question, an obvious question that will pose itself continuously. But I think that the basic set of culture has changed in this regard. In the following remarks, I will concentrate on some of the ways that these frames or spheres operate within capitalist culture, and I'm going to use two examples. One is taken from social media, and the other is from a contemporary film, Parasite. I originally wanted to also talk about another film, Roma, but to my dismay, I discovered that Amazon blocks or Netflix blocks screenshots, so I was unable to take the screenshots to illustrate my example. So I will stick to Parasite. I'd like to start off with an example taken from social media, and this concerns before I do that, I'll start talking about postmodernism and performatism before I use my examples, just to make the oppositions clearer that I'm working with. Postmodernism versus performatism. First of all, simply to cite some of Jameson's and other people's criteria for postmodernism, we find depthlessness, we find an endless surface of interlocking chains of superficial false signs that continually and endlessly refer to one another in something that Hegel would call bad immanence, I think endless immanence. Then we have the subject who is dispersed, who is fragmented, who is heteronymous. Jameson speaks here of schizophrenia, of the waning of affect. In this paradigm, otherness is very important. It's impossible to bond with anybody else because of this alterity, and the subjects are ascribed a kind of irreducible alterity that makes them ultimately we're simply unable to access them. The ethics of postmodernism is negative. Alain Badiou has done a very good critique of this in his book on ethics. He says basically it's about the right not to be oppressed, rather than proposing positive moral principles or guidelines. Basically, postmodern ethics tries to prevent oppression in a negative way. And the focal point of this ethics is peripheral victims who are considered sort of the lodestar. They're considered sort of the point of orientation for defining what is good in this negative sense. Centers are invariably considered hegemonical and negative and bad, and of course, in the Western culture, Western languages are considered to be hegemonical and to try to dominate these peripheral other cultures. Performatism is let us say different. I would not necessarily say the exact opposite, but the strategies change dramatically. And the first strategy is to create closure of some kind, something that is absolutely anathema to postmodernism. Here you can call these spaces, these closed spaces, different things. I call them frames. Peter Sloterdijk, the German philosopher, calls them spheres or bubbles. But in any case, these are frames or spheres that occlude discourse as much as possible, that shut out the sea of false signs around us, and that allow a certain focus upon a subject. With this subject now is separated, is biosocially separated. By biosocial, I mean that there can be biological reasons such as a syndrome, an illness of some kind. I think autism is in a certain sense typical of this situation. Autism has become incredibly popular as a theme in film, in novels, and of course also in the real world. That the number of diagnoses of autism has risen dramatically over the past 10, 15 years. And I personally know people who consider themselves autists or describe themselves as autists, even though in medical terms they probably aren't. So, and these subjects who may also be separated due to social reasons, poverty, their own choice. There are many different possibilities to be separated. These tend to demonstrate agency from within their separated existence. And this closure, or this closure that I'm talking about, also enables experiences of positive things, of love, beauty, transcendence within a particular frame or sphere. Whether or not this experience, this positive experience, can be transmitted to others remains open, but it is something that does take place within these enclosed spaces. What is also important here is sameness rather than alterity. That things like love, reconciliation, dyadic bonding, which is a major topic of Sloterdijk's, become very, very important. It becomes very important for these separated subjects to somehow come together. And when separated subjects do come together, this represents, in a certain sense, an act of transcendence in formal terms. Another element that is very important in ethical terms is the adherence to a truth process, something outlined by Alain Badiou once more in his quite interesting book on ethics. I can't go into this in more detail, but I simply note this as an important element of this new postmodern paradigm. What is also important here is that ethics now becomes positive. Here I follow Badiou in the sense that he says that what is important in ethics, or decisive for ethical engagement, is being faithful to a truth process, and only through this kind of faith is it possible for the individual to transcend its own animal egoism, he calls it the human animal, and to become a true subject, to become a true human subject. And he, explicit as a Marxist, he was at least a Maoist Marxist at one point. He uses a great deal of Christian terminology, and he describes this as the human subject as being, quite literally, as being transcendent. The point that I would like to add to this is that when you are in this truth process, you tend to step on other people's toes. In other words, you're not simply a victim, you are exhibiting agency of some kind, and this agency means that also leads, in my view, to, in certain cases, to an ethics of perpetration. In other words, you're doing something that you're following a certain truth process or engaged in a certain truth process, and that means that you can, as I said, step on other people's toes. What is very, very different in performatism is that centers are now considered sacral. And here, once more, we can resort to anthropology, to also to cultural anthropology, and to the Durkheimian tradition, which is also of great importance for me. But in this tradition, basically, seemingly secular things can become sacral through the process of centering. And this is basically, I think, what happens in performatism or in postmodernism. This is a new way of experiencing the sacral in secular terms, so through this formal process of being enclosed, of separation, and being centered within a community, within some sort of within some sort of system. And finally, what is crucial, at least in narrative terms, for what I'm talking about, is some sort of formal experience of transcendence, of in particular of overcoming closure, in paradoxically overcoming the boundaries of the sphere or frame in which the particular subject is enclosed. So these are, in a kind of abstract way, these are the parameters of performatism, and I would very briefly like to explain how that works using two examples. One, as I said, from social media, and the other from the film Parasite. So here, what you see here is a young woman named Kunhaparanga Tatuyo, who lives quite literally in the middle of the Brazilian rainforest. And she's a member of an indigenous tribe also called Tatuyo. And her father, who is chief of the tribe, recently got his village access to the internet and social media, which appears to be technically possible. And Kunhaparanga began using TikTok on her iPhone. And one day when she was bored, she began filming herself eating a giant bug larva, which you see here, which is apparently one of the natural food sources of her people, and is something that is quite normal for them. And to her surprise, about an hour later, she had 1 million views. And after this, she began systematically filming the eating habits, the music, the religious rituals of her people, and to this day has acquired 6 million followers, who I also am a follower. And you can be a follower too by simply clicking on her link. So she is not deliberately trying to do something strange or odd. She's simply eating something that is quite natural for her. Here you also see her family, and that they're in a kind of hybrid dress that I think the boys have Adidas pants, and at the same time they have their related costumes. So that this interaction between a global audience and someone who is normally quite isolated from the world brings into play a number of the performative qualities and strategies that I just talked about. Although Kunhaparanga is doing something that seems irreducibly exotic and strange in eating this giant white bug larva, she is able to convert this strangeness into a shared global experience. She quite evidently enjoys eating the bug. By unintentionally centering herself in this way, she becomes a kind of a cult figure that draws the interest and adoration of millions of people around her. In this way, she may also be said to transcend the narrow frame of her own existence. At the same time, she and her father consciously use TikTok or the TikTok following to help show the customs of this and similar indigenous peoples that are endangered and are worth preserving. So that in this way, the center-periphery opposition is, in a certain sense, reversed, that someone on the periphery of global capitalism is, through social media at least, temporarily placed in its center, and presumably powerless people use the power of more or less authentic images to help support the cause of self-preservation. It also has to be emphasized, of course, that this reversal of positions is not entirely symmetrical or free of friction. These people are still very poor. That Kun Haparonga's family still has trouble paying for the internet access. And because of Kun Haparonga's isolated status, she hasn't been able to monetize the internet because of her popularity. And as you see here on the picture, it might be pointed out that this Tatuyo community, while isolated, is not completely cut off from Western civilization in the way that one might imagine. Kun Haparanga for example, speaks perfect Portuguese, which is why she could communicate with the world in the first place. And she wears, as you see here, she wears Western clothes along with her native dress. So that, in other words, we're not dealing here with some sort of irreducible otherness that we don't have any access to, but with a mixture of singular local customs and rituals and more or less universally disseminated Western styles and fashions. So rather than creating here a narrative of victimization and oppression, which you could also do, we find a narrative that empowers a relatively powerless group by showcasing the beauty of their sacred rituals and customs, and one of which paradoxically includes eating giant white bug larvae. And so this the subject of bugs brings me to my second topic, which is Parasite, which is the movie Parasite, which I think many of you have seen. And I would like to apply performatism here to as I said, to an actual narrative. First of all, the devices that I will try to show here are what I call double framing, which I'll explain shortly in more detail. In the short form, we are encouraged to identify with characters or situations in the story in an inner frame, and an outer frame, the narrative, forces us in formal terms to accept this identification, whether we want to or not. In other words, we're forced to believe in someone or something in aesthetic terms, using formal means, using usually very, very palpable formal narrative means. We will also find something that I talked about earlier, which is narrative, or which is autonomous subjects exhibiting agency. And in particular, we will find peripheral subjects who actively try to occupy a center. We will also find an ethics of perpetration. These peripheral characters transgress either against laws or break the trust of the people they're dealing with in order to achieve their goal. And the main theme of the movie is not to expose this deceit, and it's not an epistemological. The film doesn't have an epistemological agenda, but it does have a kind of a theological agenda, and this is to show bonding and reconciliation as the main theme. All in all, we'll also find an ambivalent attitude towards capitalism that simply we'll also see that simply trying to become capitalist isn't necessarily a good thing, but it's also not necessarily a bad thing. Okay, so the performative double frame, as in schematic fashion, consists of an inner frame or an inner scene, and is usually accompanied by somebody who is an opaque or separated subject, somebody who is either is inaccessible to us or is inaccessible to others in the story world. And these characters often communicate by mimesis, by imitation. This is not 100% or can't be 100% the case, obviously, because discourse is always necessary, but this is possible. The next important thing in performatism is the presence of a narrative outer frame that connects up, that locks, in a certain sense, locks into the inner frame, so that there is a kind of agreement or tautology between the outer frame and the inner frame. The narrative, in other words, forces us to identify with something in the narrative. It can be any number of things. It can be a person. It can be a scene. It can also be a process to a certain extent. This is the basic way that performatism works. And finally, what is also crucial is that we have the feeling that there is there's a very strong authorial mediation of transcendence. In other words, that there is something in the narrative that evokes transcendence in some way, and that this has been expedited by an author of some kind whose force we feel in through this process of double frame. So once more, this is the basic scheme of postmodernism. Of course, it's not realized perfectly in real life narratives, but I believe that in Parasite, we can establish numerous, I would say, elements of this scheme. So to skip to the movie, which I'll reduce very much to its basics. This is also will spoil everything, unfortunately, for everybody who has not seen the movie, but there is no way to get around this. And this is one of the most exciting movies that I've ever seen. This is, I think, when I saw it, I was absolutely, I was really gnawing at my fingers the whole time. The basic plot is that a poor but well-educated family pretends to be unrelated to one another to gain access to the house of a wealthy family, which you can consider the inner frame for the purposes of my analysis. Much of the action takes place within this house of the wealthy family, and one by one, the poor but well-educated family gains access to the house by pretending to be tutors, by forging documents, by lying about their connections with other people, and so on and so forth. So at the end, in the course of the film, this entire family, mother, father, son, and daughter, begin to work for the rich or the wealthy family. The further development of this is that the poor family temporarily manages to take over the inner frame of the house. Here you see them living it up, while the wealthy family is on vacation. The problem is that there is a second inner frame. In other words, there is a second dimension to this framing within the narrative, and that is that within the house of the wealthy people, there's a basement, a secret basement room, where the previous housekeeper has hidden her husband from his creditors. And this second frame and the fact that the husband is still living in the house leads to all sorts of problems, which I can't go into in detail. But the upshot of it is that the father of the poor family murders the father of the rich family. There is a bloody sort of melee at the end of the movie. And what happens is that the father manages to escape, who was a murderer, manages to escape to this basement room, to shut it up. Nobody knows about it. And he remains there undiscovered for 4 years. For once more for reasons how he does this. I can't explain at length, but it's in terms of the film's logic, it's quite possible. He can always open the secret door, go to the refrigerator, and one of the reasons is that the people who live there are foreigners. They come and go. They don't notice that things are missing from their fridge. So that another plot twist in this story is that the father is able to communicate with the son through Morse code. And once more, if you haven't seen the film, it doesn't sound plausible. The film, of course, makes it plausible. The father can manipulate the garage lights in such a way as to send semaphore signals or Morse code signals rather to his son, so they're able to, or he's able to communicate. And the son, who has survived this massacre at the end of the movie, hasn't given up his dream is to get enough money to buy the house, to free his father. Now, this doesn't happen in the course of the movie, but what does happen is that in an imaginary scene, the father and son are reunited on the threshold of this house. So that you see here the father and son bonding on this threshold between inside and outside, which I would say qualifies as an act of transcendence. This, once more, this imaginary scene is something that is, it's hard to say whether it's the son is dreaming it, but in any case, the author of the movie itself imposes this final scene upon us in the narrative, so that we are, in a sense, forced to identify with the possibility of this transcendence. So that once more, bonding, this kind of bonding overcomes the captivity, the closure of the father, and lets the son bond with him. So that, in closing my analysis, I would say, first of all, the poor family's actions are all directed towards a center, to entering a closed center frame and leaving the periphery. The periphery is not idealized in any way. The poor family uses deceitful means, even criminal means, to do this. This is an ethics of perpetration. The film forces us to identify with the family in spite of their deceitful tactics, as we have seen through double framing. And the inner frame and center, the house, acquire a sacral quality at the end, as we've also seen, that this sort of bonding, this sort of reunification of father and son has a definite Christian touch to it. The attitude of the film towards capitalism, as we have seen, is ambivalent. That we have kind of a local version of global capitalism, which is embodied by the well-to-do family. This life is shown to be rather sterile, all in all, but at the same time, it is more desirable than living in poverty. So what happens is, I think here, is that you have the filmmakers, whether consciously or unconsciously, have employed Hegel's master-slave dialectic, that the clever, thinking, reflecting slaves are much more interesting than the unthinking masters, but these slaves long to become those unthinking but very comfortably living masters. Finally, in conclusion, I would say that postmodernism and performatism are both reactions to global capitalism, that they simply work through very, very different strategies. The postmodernism works through strategies of dispersing the subject, making it hard to pin down, creating a kind of defense by weakening the subject, by making it hard to get a handle on. It works through disillusionment, through strategies of irony, of play of ludism, but also by privileging the victim and the periphery. And performatism is once more completely opposed to this. It separates the subject, it cuts it off from discourse, it privileges the center or the free space in which the subject is enclosed. It enables an ethics of perpetration. In other words, it allows the subject, it privileges agency over victimization. It also creates, through the means of formal enclosure and centering, a kind of a sacral quality. It gives the characters very often a sacral quality, and it offers different modes of transcendence as a kind of a goal for characters in these narratives. Whether or not this goal is actually achieved is something else. In many narratives, it's not, but it is definitely appears as the prime goal, and is treated positively in works of this kind. And I think with that, that's the end of my presentation, which I said was a bit shortened because I was unable to show you pictures or screenshots from another film. So with that, I thank you for your patience, and I would open this up for discussion as soon as I'll end the PowerPoint. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Eshelman. Thank you very much for the very interesting talk, for the interesting presentation. I'm sure that there are many people in the audience who would like to discuss these things with you. We have a lot of distinguished scholars in the audience, but I would like to misuse the position of the chair and to make my comment. What I really appreciate is your discussion of the film, which I believe can be seen as a realistic film. Yeah, it represents a kind of realistic mode of narrating. And when I compare it with your analysis of the life of P, which is also very intriguing, provided in your book, that film can be read in terms of kind of magical realism. There are elements that can be understood in terms of magical realism. So I understand, see this as a very important and interesting addition, how performatism can be applied to realistic narratives. What I'm interested in, however, is how would you apply your concept of the ostensive sign in the interpretation of this film, but it's possible because it's a very important concept in your theory.
Yeah, that's a very interesting observation. As I said, I did a very, very brief summary of the film. In the film, the main character has a big rock that he carries around with him. For those of you who've seen the movie, if you haven't seen the movie, it's difficult to explain. This seems to be something that is common, that has been explained to me. This is something that is typical of Far Eastern culture, that stones, rocks have some sort of magical or talismanic quality. And he seems to, this stone seems to have this quality. It's carried from the poor people's house to the rich people's house. It's used as a weapon, I think, to hit somebody over the head. And finally, the son at the end gets rid of it. He puts it in water. And this is the closest thing that I could find in the movie to that kind of ostensive sign, but it's very ambivalent. It's a sign that seems to have a sacral quality. It's also used as a weapon, which, in other, it's a real thing. Ostensive signs are real things. They're always present. They always are directly assigned to an object. But this rock seems to be ambivalent, but it also seems, by placing it, I think, in water, in a stream, he seems to have also achieved a kind of transcendence in that way. But this is, once more, this is a speculative interpretation of just what this stone means in the movie. But this would seem to be an example of that.
Thank you very much. It really makes sense to me, because I can see some parallels with the sound that P makes to tame the tiger, and you interpret this in the film The Life of Pi as the scene that allows us to perceive intuitively God. Yeah, the presence of God is God helps Pi to tame the tiger. And your explanation of the stone appears to be very similar. The stone appears to perform the same function, actually.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to ask members of the audience to join the discussion, pose questions. Okay, my colleague Martina Martausová.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Eshelman, for a very, very interesting talk. I would just like to go back and ask you about the concept of overcoming closure that you've mentioned with respect to Parasite, the film. How does that apply to the film? What is the closure and how it's overcome? Is it the fact that they eventually imagine that bonding process? Is that what you refer to, this overcoming of closure? Do I understand that correctly?
Yes, I believe that in the film, it's this closure. It becomes quite literal in the sense that the father is in this. I assume you've seen the movie. I assume, yeah. So he's really in this basement. He can't get out because if he does, he'll be accused of murder. So that he is in a certain sense stuck there forever, and that this separation is quite literally overcome in this imaginary scene at the end. The closure, I suppose you could see in more social terms, you could see closure in the way that the role playing takes place within the film, that this family who all live together and who interact intimately, they assume social roles that separate themselves from one another, and separate themselves also, of course, from their employers who don't know that they're actually connected to one another. So separation is a theme in the movie, and it's ambivalent.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks.
Any other questions from the audience? Okay, again, Sylvia.
Yes, may I? Again, I would like to thank you for the talk, and I also rewatched one of your older talks for Parallax this week in preparation for this. And you were talking today about performatism, being kind of like a reaction to our social economic situation. And in that older talk, you mentioned like some drawbacks of modernism and postmodernism and the problems that kind of arise from those two in how they engage with the world. And I was wondering if we can kind of like predict some problems that will follow from performatism and like what we should be wary of and look out for. Because you mentioned like we are trying to overcome postmodern irony and the disconnect, but what should we be kind of like careful about in terms of performatism? Are there any kind of like inherent problems in it that you can already see?
Well, there are lots of inherent problems. There are lots and lots of inherent problems. One is the tendency to treat reality in aesthetic terms. That this is one problem. Also, separation is in itself a problem. It's a formal problem. When I'm separated, I can't interact with other people. I exist only for myself. How do I overcome that? And separation in itself is something that is not positive. I would say, in other words, it's what has to be overcome. And what you see in many narratives, especially in Russian narratives, is that it's not overcome. That there's a very pessimistic. I think initially there was a very optimistic tone to this kind of performatist narrative. I saw it in particular in the Dogma movies. The many films from around the year 2000 were quite optimistic, and this tone has now changed, I think. I can't predict what is beyond performatism, unfortunately. I've been looking for it. In other words, it would have to be another paradigm change. It would have to be something I can absolutely not explain using my means, and I haven't found that yet. And I'd be happy if anybody could tell me if there's anything like that. But up to the present time, I've been only able to find really sort of residual postmodernism. It still exists, obviously, and this sort of these sort of performatist postmodern narrative.
Yeah, that was supposed to be my follow-up question. Like, what is coming next? If already we are skeptical.
I'm looking. I'm hoping to find things that I can't explain. This is but up to now I haven't seen them.
Thank
you. Any other questions from the audience? I can see, yes, my colleague Julius would like to ask something.
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I liked every word I heard. I just would like to express my gratitude for these sentences and for this presentation, because it gives me hope with your explanation of performatism. I understand that we finally get rid of the cultural skepticism and relativism of postmodern, and we again embrace the cultural heritage that we can build on. I happened to see that film and I enjoyed your explanation. Now I understand that there are a series of biblical references. For example, the person's separation in the basement is something like a tour through the hell, or the symbol of the rock may be understood as the sin that the son of the person, the son of the father, is entitled to somehow clean the sin of his father, and the reunification is something like a resurrection from the basement, or resurrection from the
yeah. And of course, the stone is also Peter. That's also something.
Yeah.
It's there are lots of biblical things in it.
So thank you for all that, because I feel that, or I have the feeling that finally we will find the way back to the cultural continuity that postmodernism somehow disrupted in the end of the 20th century. This is just my comment. It's not a question. Thank you again very much for that.
And I'm glad that I gave you an optimistic feeling.
Yes, definitely. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I can see that Professor Onega is interested in joining the discussion. She'd like to pose a question.
Yes, thank you very much. Very briefly, I enjoyed your talk a lot, and I have seen the film, so I'll give you my impression simply of the ending. You left them at the threshold between the inner and the outer world, and also the situation of the father. He was left inside what has just been called the inner hell for 4 years. So for me, this sets a pattern of repetition. They are not the first slaves, to use Hegelian terminology. They were not the first slaves who attempted to, to seize the center, to violently, through this ethics of perpetration that you mentioned, but they really failed because it is simply around. To me, I'm Spanish. I have a stronger sense of the picaresque tradition. The picaresques always trying to take hold of the center and failing once after the other. So for me, this repetition establishes an irony at the heart of the film, that again reminds me of postmodernist irony. So I think the ending for me is open. I'm sorry to say it's not closed. There is an attempt to close it. There is a move towards the closure, but in the end, the story is left open. What would you say to this?
Okay, I would say, okay, you're right about the picaresque element, certainly, of the film, that these are, but picaros don't develop, and I believe that one of the points of the movie is that the son actually develops, and also in picaresque novels there is. The film does have a narrative conclusion, which is imposed on us, which a picaresque novel would not have. Basically, they just keep on going and going and going. and are in narrative, in formal narrative. I'm talking about formal narrative terms. In formal narrative terms, it's closed, and that's really my prime criteria. What you say is correct, that it's ambivalent. The father is in hell. The attempt to occupy the center remains a dream. You can see it quite critically, but what my point is, and this is an aesthetic point, is simply that the ending is not that of a picaresque novel. It is a formally closed ending. The content is open. The ethics are open. Is it good or bad to do that? The film doesn't answer that question because it's a good movie.
Well, I found it quite horrifying, by the way, but thank you very much for the explanation.
I mean, it is horrifying in a certain sense, but it has this, like I said, this optimistic, this sacral conclusion that you can't deny. Yeah.
Okay.
If I can add something to this point, I can see a parallel with the life of P once again, because there's a possibility of seeing or focusing on the horrifying explanation of the story. That there was no tiger, no beauty, no God. There was just a killer, and the protagonist murders the potential killer. So there is a horrifying version of the story that we can focus on, and then the novel, the film, offers also a possibility to choose the beautiful version. We know, rationally we know that, okay, it's probably not the truth, but it's much more beautiful and it's much more satisfying in aesthetic terms. And to me, at least, I understand in this way that it gives us hope, that we can experience this hope. And just to say something that I wanted to say, definitely I appreciate in performative works the fact that I feel that they reinstall the artistic space as the space in which we can escape and we can experience as the readers a certain form of transcendence. And I understand this as a kind of help that helps us, or space that helps us to cope with the world. Something that you mentioned in the title of your topic. Art as the space that helps us to cope with the world. So it's just my point, that my understanding of all this.
Yeah, no, I think this is true, that it's a kind of a therapy or a therapeutic moment, but it's of course always threatened by the outside world and by other things that of course are not optimistic, are not beautiful, and there's always this basic tension that performatism isn't an exercise in making happy endings. That's my main point.
Okay, thank you. Okay, any other questions from the audience? I cannot see. Susanna, yes, please.
Hello, good morning. I would also like to say a big thank you for your wonderful presentation. I would like to ask you whether you see some examples of performatism in Slavic culture, since you have expertise in Slavic culture. In your lectures, you usually give examples of performatist art coming either from Europe or from Western cultures, but can you give us some examples of performatist culture in Slavic context?
Yes, I can, but I recently just wrote an article in Russian about Russian examples from Russian culture. One example that I can give is the most. I'm trying to think of something that would be accessible to most people. One example is a realistic writer named Zakhar Prilepin, who you may have heard of. He is a very unpleasant figure. He's a very right-wing adherent of Putin, but he writes basically in a realistic style. But what he does is that he withholds, as a narrator, he withholds something from us in the narrative, so that what happens is that the stories he's talking about the things he's narrating seem very realistic, but there's always a missing element that suggests some sort of transcendence within these stories. This is one example. Another example I'm trying to think of, there are many Russian movies that are more that are, let us say, pretty explicit about showing transcendence. One would be a movie by Andrei Konchalovsky called Paradise, where once more these movies are, Russian films don't get shown all over the place, so it's difficult to, I assume that most people will not have seen it, but once more Konchalovsky plays with the idea that people who are involved in a tragic story about a concentration camp are interviewed in effect by St. Peter, who is also a cameraman, who is also a filmmaker, and that these people and their confess before the camera in order to get into paradise, and only one makes it. This is very explicit sort of use of transcendence. So I would say these are two poles within, at least within Russian culture. One is this realistic element, which we've also seen with Parasite, that these films can be quite realistic in the sense that they don't include any transcendent actions, unbelievable actions, and on the other hand, then you have these imagined constructs where transcendence is explicit. And I was looking for actually Slovak examples before I came, but I didn't have enough time to read myself into Slovak literature, so
Yeah, I remember that you have offered one example from Czech literature. It's Urban's Seven Churches, so it's in your book.
From Urban, and from, there are also numerous Czech film examples, I think, that also do something similar.
I can see a raised hand. Martina, would you like to pose a question, or just no?
No, I'm sorry, I forgot to
Okay.
do the thing. Sorry.
Okay. Any other? Frederica is raising her hand.
Yes, thank you. I have a question about something which was mentioned in the presentation about performatism occluding discourse, or that subject is cut off from discourse in performative work of art. Does performatism try to completely reduce the reliance on discourse, or could be there some instances when it tries to utilize discourse for some specific way to serve the performative purpose, maybe?
That's also a tricky question to answer, because I would have to have, I would have to have examples of. I'm trying to think of in Parasite how a discourse works as a concrete example. I believe that from the performative perspective, discourse is inherently deceitful. So the family also uses discourse to forge documents, to pretend to be something. To be something that they're not, and in the end, I suppose you could say, if you want to use the film as an example, that there is a kind of a discourse, but it's the Morse code. Discourse has been reduced to something probably possibly the most simple kind of communication, which is also in this case one-sided. That's about the best I can do under the circumstances. It's a difficult topic. I think one theme that is very important that I already mentioned is autism. And in clinical terms, an autist has trouble processing information from the outside world. And in this sense, the autist is a kind of performatist ideal, because this is the ideal performative subject is going to be in some way shut off from the outside, or from outside discourse. And this shutting off from outside discourse is what makes the subject singular, and what gives the subject a chance to in a certain sense, to develop on its own.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? I know the time is up, but still I would like to point out that what I find really intriguing in your theory is the concept of the staged narrator and the function it has in the text. It's quite easy.
I quite understand
staged narrator. And when a kind of third person perspective is used, yeah, I can understand easily how this narrator can function as a kind of authorial figure imposing certain vision on us. But I find it quite intriguing in the case of the first person narrators. It's very interesting, and I myself would like to explore it in some of my papers. I know we don't have a lot of time, but maybe in a few sentences, in what sense the first person narrator can actually adopt the position of an authorial narrator in the text?
There are, I think the easiest way to do that is to die.
Of course, yeah.
There are numerous instances of this that when a character dies and continues to narrate, then this character will have definite authorial features. There are other ways to do this, but I think this is the most obvious one.
The easiest one. So, but you believe that it's possible to explore it also in the case of the narrators who are still alive?
Yes. This is also quite possible. I'm trying to think now of and desperately trying to think of an example that would fit this, but I can't at the moment.
The answer is yes, I'm happy. Thank you that I have a chance to explore.
Okay, but they do exist, and it's quite an interesting narrative question to pursue.
Okay, thank you very much. If there are no other questions, I would like to thank you once again.
Yes.
Okay, sorry, Dolores. Yes, of course.
Thank you very much for your fascinating talk. I really enjoyed very, very much. Just one question, since I am very, very interested in the revival of all of these pre-modern cultures, and you mentioned, these tribes from the Brazil. Do you think, this is my question, do you think that this revival is somehow contributing to the emergence of this paradigm you were explaining to us? I mean, these, in particular, the importance of transcendence. Would you say that they are somehow contributing to this?
But I didn't understand the last part, just acoustically.
Would you say that the revival of all of these pre-modern cultures is somehow contributing to the consolidation of the fact that this transcendence is playing such an important role in this performatism you were explaining to us?
Yes, I believe this is true. In other words, I believe that things like ritual, the idea of ritual is very important. And obviously a source of, perhaps the only source of ritual left are these pre-modern cultures. So that you will find, I think in novels, movies, films, whatever, you will find recourse to these kind of rituals, these kind of originary, cultural patterns. I think also. I think this is quite true.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. So, any further questions, or can I close the session now? So, as I was starting to say, thank you very much, Professor Eshelman, for your talk.
And I thank you for the friendly reception.
Thank you for all the questions, and I just like to express my hope that Professor Eshelman will be able to stay with us for a while. Maybe he'll join some of the sessions.
Yeah, I'm going to join.
We will be happy if he could find the time for that. And now it's the break, and I will see you soon in the parallel sessions.